Hello class, we're going to talk a bit about sculpture, and this basically will be an introductory type of lecture. Primarily focus on two types of sculpture, but lots of materials we'll talk about, but two main sort of types would be freestanding or in the round sculpture and relief sculpture. Sculpture is an artistic form, it's a visual, in which harder plastic materials, so that could be a lot of different type of materials, are worked into three-dimensional art objects. So the main consideration of sculpture that differentiates it from other art forms is the three dimension. Now that could be embodied in freestanding objects and reliefs on surfaces, or in environments that could range from like a tableau to a whole context that envelops the spectator or participant, which would be like immersive installation art. But the real constant, I should say, is the branch of visual arts that is especially concerned with the creation of forms in 3D space. So that's what really gives it its distinction throughout all the ages, of which it's been made for a very long time, and lots of different materials. It is also expressive, of course, like any art, but I want to kind of talk about how it is both formal and expressive and kind of unpack what those words mean. What do we mean by the word formal in art? Well, there are formal properties that it has, such as things in design like color, space, texture, which is actual in sculpture, volume, mass, which is like the density of materials. So with this piece by Jessica Stockholder, it's entitled, there's a lot of materials here: lumber, carpet, fake furs, a plastic toolbox, plastic and ceramic knickknacks, acrylic paint, silicone caulking, a wall hook that holds it up. And some people would say, this doesn't look like art. This is a crazy, weird thing that, no way that's art. But it most certainly is. I want to read to you a quote that she said. I work on top of or in relation to stuff that I collect. I don't see a dichotomy between formalism and something else. Form and formal relations are important because they mean something. Their meaning grows out of our experience as physical, mortal beings of a particular scale in a relationship to the world as we find it and make it. I don't buy that formalism is meaningless. So there's a sort of movement in art criticism in the 19th century on that began to be called art for art's sake, which was formalism. And they sort of took the idea that all the meaning, or what it should be, is only the form, and the form being, in sculpture and art, the shapes in which it takes within a piece and the overall gestalt shape. And she's kind of arguing back that the form has meaning, that there's expressive qualities of form, that the images in quotes or objects it creates, which are like images, subject matter and expressiveness of form are like mutually reinforcing each other. That the form creates meaning and the meaning helps create and decide upon which forms you use. This is important because we could get focused on only the design of something being aesthetic, and that's fine, but we could miss out on the possibility of having some expression of meaning and things we care about. And then we could go deep into expression and maybe lose track of how the forms are working. They can be interrelated in a way that's really interesting. So we looked at what sculpture is. We looked at expressiveness and form. Let's talk about a little bit more about this. The way in which work, I said, can be beyond the facts of it, a wide range of emotions. What are the facts of this piece? It was born made in 1986 by a specific person, Louise Bourgeois. It is made out of marble, right? It's a nature study, she calls it. Interestingly enough, it is a giant knot here, made large, the type of knot she would have had to do when she was younger for tapestries she would repair. And for her, this knot is really concerns about her childhood, her gender, kind of the aggression and creativity of her mother. She studied mathematics and philosophy at the Sorbonne, but in her childhood she learned to draw while assisting her mother in the family business of repairing antique tapestries. This is a quote. Her task was to draw the partial figures and patterns missing from the damaged works so that they could be replicated by the reweavers. So she's talking about her experience, and there's an idea that surrealists believe that the expressions of the unconscious find expressions out in the world. And I think there's something here about this, that the most traditional and permanent almost of all mediums, stone, very, very long history of working in stone, carved marble, is coming out with something that is very much about her experience lived and kind of her subconscious in a way. So it's beyond the facts of it. And in art history, sometimes they talk about um, art being a persisting event that would be something that was made at a particular time by a particular people or person and now is in the present. So it has a history from before. It's part of art history and now exists in the present as an experience. So there's an interesting way in which she people who make art are dealing with that type of thing. Why do we make art? So we have the idea of communicating subtle and powerful feelings, expressive, formal. We care about aesthetics and beauty, and maybe making form. So we're really involved intimately with 3D forms from an early age. All human beings learn something of structure and expressive properties. You could say building with blocks as a kid. This combination of like an understanding of how things work and sensitive like responding even as a kid to things like dough and clay creates a sense of what we would call form. And I think that this sense of form in art is different in 2D and 3D, but in sculpture it primarily applies to these 3D forms. And I think that this type of sensitivity, is in everyone to a certain extent. And then people who are especially sensitive to it and care about it may decide to further investigate it as sculpture. But there is something inborn, I believe, in humans about making form from formlessness, not just in art, but things like houses and spaces we live in and roads and all different sorts of things in life. So this is a very natural thing that we're engaging in when we're engaging in sculpture. There's two main sort of forms of sculpture as branches. We could talk about relief and then freestanding or in the round sculpture. We're going to look at mostly versions of these. So, from long history of them. The total breadth of possible materials and methods of a sculpture is long and interesting history. It's really beyond time in this one lecture. And you could have a large amount of growing number of books about it because things keep getting added into this, like light and space and all sorts of different things. But we're going to talk about sort of some of the more traditional or generally easily accepted types of materials and these two forms. So a relief, which this is an example of Gates of Hell by Rodin, projects from its background. It's attached to something else that serves as a background against which it comes out of it, which it's set. You could say a matrix from which it emerges. So The relief is from this matrix of a door and around it. Okay? We could think about it as a series of carvings from the very highest plane back into space to the matrix. So it's a successive number of planes going back and back and back. Oftentimes carved out of things like wood or stone in the past. And it's kind of divided into the relationships from the relationships of the space from the very back matrix down into it, or from the up from it. So in this piece, the artist is actually carving into the matrix, right? So everything they're carving is getting deeper. On the very front plane is the front of the wood. But another way you could do it is by carving away, or in this case, modeling wax on top of, so it pops out more from the matrix, or could drop in or be incised relief as well. There's an interesting thing about this where it has a possible pictorial and sculptural combination, because it becomes this interesting mix of something like a picture, right? Because we have in pictures height and width, and it's usually flat. But this has a height and width that's similar to a picture plane, but then it also has the 3D sculptural, so the creation of actual depth on it, and shadow and light, the way it affects it. So it deals with pictorial space like a painting. It's depending on a supporting surface, but unlike that painting, it actually manipulates real light because of shadow and the way light hits it, versus painting, the light is created through the application of color and value, right? So it's an illusion of light. This is a real light that's being messed with. So that's an interesting differentiation between like other types of two-dimensional art and relief that I just want to kind of point out so you can understand that a little bit more. I want to say one last thing about relief before we go on. The central concern with relief is sort of condensing of 3D form and spatial relationships in a limited depth. So when you have in the round sculpture, the depth is not limited in the same way, right? Because you're all the way around, it's a full object. Well, because it's attached to a matrix, has a background, there's a limited amount of depth, so you're playing with those relationships in a way that's very specific to that type of sculpture. Very, very interesting. And some types of relief get a lot deeper and have more depth. This is pretty low relief here compared to some of the stuff we can look at. So the materiality and the way it's applied makes a big difference to this. This is two relief bison from long, long ago inside of a cave, made out of mud from a different part of the cave. This is a relief sculpture. The cracks probably happened shortly after the artist made it because it's not fired clay. But it's got a lot of depth to it. So this is a cave in the French Pyrenees, and it contained a lot of art, including like rock engravings, cave paintings, and things. And this is one of the more sublime and larger sculptures from the Paleolithic era, made by hand with like simple tools like a spatula. But you can see how eventually at the back it's still attached to the matrix, the cave floor, and this big rock. So it's still dealing with attached to a matrix, but it's almost becoming like in the round, and the materiality of it is very presently part of it, you know. So it's playing with that materiality, which is a huge part of sculpture in general, is the material, the feeling of the material. Then there's things like Trajan's column from a long ago, 113 AD CE. It's a relief wrapping all the way around this column like an unrolling scroll. And on it are these detailed carvings talking about Trajan, who's an emperor, his victory over the Dacians. And so it's a very triumphal, continuous narrative. And a lot of reliefs, this shows this idea, are not really autonomous in that they're not able to be moved around like a picture or an object. They actually are often linked to a form, such as a building, or in this case, a public piece of art, as decoration. So there's a kind of a long history of this, and this is a lot of the type of reliefs we'll see for things like domestic use, personal, civic, like this would be a public monument, or even like sacred artifacts in temples and spaces. So this is low or bas relief. You can get really high relief where it can almost feel like it's becoming in 3D, where it's undercut. That's an undercut where it goes down beneath it, like where you can't really necessarily see exactly where it's attached. This is from a legend depicted in the relief is a story of the descent of the sacred river Ganges to earth from the heavens. And so it's more of like a spiritual, religious type of work. And high relief projects far enough to be almost independent. That's what I'm talking about when I'm saying undercuts. So it gets close to being fully in the round, but it's still not fully in the round. It's still attached to the background. So we're using these type of ideas to say low, high, but really it's almost like a continuous range from almost completely pictorial, like, or we could say even incised, where it's dropping down, all the way up to where it's almost becoming like in the round fully. So there's other classes like middle and recessed or incised relief that people talk about besides low and high. We're going to move on to another type of work that we talked about. We're going to talk about two main types, which is freestanding or in the round. It's pretty clear what the meaning, I would say, would be that it's able to be fully moved around, not necessarily walked around, maybe turned in your hand, but it's a detached object in its own right. This is an example of a public piece of art by Anish Kapoor, a large mirror piece that reflects the sky and the surroundings called Cloudgate. Viewers are able to walk beneath it and look up into this navel called a Omophilus. It's got an origin as an object in Greek mythology and religion, and is considered an object of power. So this has some type of symbolic references to cup of red wine, royal blood, all kinds of ideas of fertility even. And it does look like a giant cloud and it reflects the sky. So it's an interesting piece of art. Has a lot more to it than you would first see, just like a giant bean almost. But it shows the idea that it has a separate, disconnected, it could be moved anywhere. It's really heavy, but it's not connected. It's detachable if you wanted to in its own right. And it has a vivid physical presence that is denied in like pictorial arts and different than even relief. So this is real space, not just optical space. There's a critic, Sir Herbert Reed, that has a quote there. I'll read it out. Sculpture can be regarded as primarily an art of touch, and that the roots of sculptural sensibilities can be traced to the pleasure one experiences in fondling things, touching things. So there's a strong tactile and visual sensibility with it, right? When you see this in person, this little girl is touching it. It's smooth, it's big, it's round. It has, even if you're not supposed to touch it because it's in a museum or a gallery, you're not supposed to touch art if you didn't know. It has that sensibility, that feeling like you want to touch it. This one here, don't really want to touch it actually, because there's something in it that's kind of feels creepy and gross to me. Like if I got my mustache in my mouth while I was trying to drink coffee with fur covering this object. She covered this object in fur to play with that idea, I think. And it has a sort of beauty to it, though, at the same time. And we could feel it even by looking at it, we could know that it would feel soft and kind of maybe coarse too at the same time. So very much touch is involved, or the idea of even touching if you can't touch it. Part of freestanding works is the idea of natural balance. So a lot of the work that you look at with freestanding work is able to balance on its own. Sometimes it has a pedestal or is connected to the ground, like that piece is. And what we mean by that natural balance is making the sculpture stable enough to stand firmly. So when you're making your work, you need to think about how it balances on the table, chair, wall, how it's connected to the earth or the place you're putting it. The most stable way to make a structure results when any three planes, it's called the three planes rule, meet so that each plane intersects with both of the other ones. So triangles on the ground, you can imagine, would be really stable. What are we talking about here? We're talking about three planes being the way in which, if you're looking at it from above or even the side, you can do it a lot of different ways. But if you have planes interacting, that's very solid. Does it have to be straight? No, you could do it like different ones. But it still is very solid if you have the three planes connected. So that would be the rule of three planes, something to think about. It even works with wire or rods and things like that too. Just want to point that out as something to think about when you're making your work. Other pieces are designed to need a base or plinth in some way. This one, because of the angle of like a bird flight, this is supposed to be like a bird flying up, needs it because of the kind of angle and the length of it compared to the width of it. So you could design it for a base to make it stable if it's really tall and thin. Sometimes that's common in work. I personally like work that feels like it's autonomously connected to the space it's in. You'll see a lot of modern work that sort of leans on the wall even, in a way. That's something that's pretty common in contemporary artwork. So, talking about the stability and structure of it with those two slides, I want to move on a bit to the idea of the view of sculpture, where you see it from. This piece is made to have a frontal view. So it is a piece by Michelangelo, the Medici Chapel. It's the actual tomb of one of the Medicis. And so in this piece, it's in a spot where it's made to be looked at from one direction, basically one or two directions straight on. And it's made to be viewed from like a couple fixed positions. So this is one way, even though it's in the round, it has a sort of controlling of where you're supposed to look at it from, right? Then there's sort of another type of sculpture that's very common. This is a piece from the Renaissance, also an incident from Roman mythology in which Rome committed a mass abduction, the name here meaning abduction, of young women from the other cities in the region. It's actually a frequent subject of artists from the Renaissance and post-Renaissance. This axial or freestanding sculpture is made to be viewed from every direction. It's actually able to move all the way around it, and there's details everywhere. It has no principal view that you're supposed to look at it. This one's like one or two. This one is made to be viewed from all over, central axis of the composition. It almost looks like it's around a pole in a way. So that's another way to think about the view of a sculpture. It doesn't have to be large for this. It could be something even you can hold in your hand, and you're able to spin it every direction and it has detail. Or it could be something you hold in your hand or small and you only see it from the front too. So it's not necessarily about scale as much as the direction or the way it's designed to be viewed, where it's mostly the detail is and where you're drawing the attention to the viewer's eye is part of this as well. Some things are interesting because they're all around you. Eva Hesse repetition. of this shape. It's got multiple perspectives, and you're like walking through them. And this is one piece of artwork that's got 19 repetitions of this shape. So this is like a multi-directional form in space, getting towards the idea of installation art. The viewer is made aware of the all-around design that, and also in a different way, maybe their own body. And every one of these are aware of your own body in different ways, the weight of them and the way you move around them. So this one doesn't have a particular axis or angle you're supposed to look at it from. So it's a multiple perspective all around, versus this one is like an axis that you move, an axis, like a spoke in a wheel that you're supposed to move around. Now, we could talk again about, I want to say a little bit more about what I said about holding it in your hand. So, holding in your hand, we could, in a way, argue is the most complete in the round sculpture, right? Because they have no base. Even these pieces, even though they're all the way in the round, they have a base. You can't see the bottom of them, right? So you could turn them fully and view it literally from every direction. But these, just like large sculptures in galleries, can't are made in such a way as for you to think about them, right? This is made for you to think about it as a completely autonomous object that can be moved anywhere. But same with these, they're not connected to the earth or the base in a specific way. So they're actually pretty autonomous as well. But because you can't pick up these type of things in a gallery, you're not allowed to. You could pick them up, but you're not supposed to. They're not quite as fully autonomous as this. So these type of sculptures are really made from a lot of different materials you've been looking at so far, right? We had stone, resin, a lot of stone so far, metal, polished brass, a saucer and a cup, more metal. So we have quite a few different ones. I'm keeping it fairly traditional, but there's actually a lot of really, now, especially in modern and contemporary artwork, pieces made out of all sorts of materials. This is a good example from 1959. The example of listed materials like oil, paper, printed reproductions, metal, wood, rubber, shoe heel, tennis ball, canvas, wood mounted on 4 wheels with an Angora goat and a rubber tire. So we're talking about a crazy number of materials here, right? This is like, what? Compared to just a stone or plastic, or metal piece. They're having like a totally different conversation here about found materials, materials that have been altered. And so contemporary and modern sculpture has no specific special materials. Any material, natural or man-made, could be used and has probably been used. That brings into the conversation the idea of a found object. This artist, Louise Nevelson, used to walk the street and find bits of furniture that had been like discarded, and then she would make pieces by unifying them together with a single color. So she would build them and assemble them out of found objects. Ready-mades also are what these are called sometimes, and then appropriate or use them together to create this thing, and then bring visual unity by painting a color. There's a lot going on here. It brings in the history of the form, the actual felt history of the object, and talks about finding things and collecting and all sorts of interesting things that we could go on and on about. But let's continue on. Also, even very ephemeral materials have been used. So that means things that could be easily damaged or not last. He uses beeswax, Wolfgang Lab, and feathers and pollen and sugar, bird seeds, foliage, ice and snow, candy. So it's interesting that the artist utilizes the inherent qualities of natural materials here to create like a really interesting experience that can comment on like spiritual and natural ideas, and we could say this is like almost like a minimalism that's adding a lot more to it. It's really interesting. I like how the beeswax becomes this thing that feels like it could melt or be destroyed, and we have something that feels like stairs, but you couldn't probably walk on them. It's very interesting. So, stone carving, we've seen a lot of that so far. And Rodin is often thought of the originator or progenitor of modern sculpture, the first modern sculptor, um, because his original work departed from traditional themes of mythology and allegory, and then he began to model the human body with a naturalism, and then celebrate the individual character and physicality of people, as well as he reused forms and people from molds and work quite a bit. What do I mean by that? For example, this is one of his pieces. Some of these different people here, the thinker, for example, he used the mold for more than one piece. So he would actually assemble these out of wax, and he would use them like a multiplicity of them, possibly cast them in wax and then change them, which is a very different idea, change in ideas from earlier ways of working where you're talking about a singular thing. Even if you're casting, you're not trying to reuse the same form in that same way. So certain materials lend themselves to being worked with a particular method, and we could say those methods often serve this certain forms and purposes. So you often see certain type of materials put in certain locations or used in certain ways because they work the best. Like a material has a way that it wants to be worked. And you could push and fight against it, but often it's best to actually go with the properties of it and use it for its best purposes, so to speak. Now, there's a lot of people who kind of fight against that and push against it as part of their artistic process and practice, but I think it's important to kind of know and think about that. So stone lasts really well outside for really long periods of time, has a lot of weight, attaches well to certain type of things, so we'd use it in certain locations. Now, wood assembling and carving is a whole different matter, right? And I think as compared to stone, which would have a high resistance to weather and be really suitable outside and be able to be obtained in large blocks in certain places with fairly homogeneous texture, wood is also something that you could find a lot of places, and can be carved and assembled once it's made into like dimensional lumber. People will mill it down. And so it has a sort of way in which it's been used also quite a long time by every great civilizations that have it in their areas. There's some that don't, but much of the world has it. It gives it a lot of tensile strength. So it can be carved thinly with greater freedom than stone. And grain is really attractive in wood, right? So a lot of times people use that. It gives a variety of pattern and texture. It has a lot more warmth than stone. So it's very strong if you build with it properly, and it can last really well and in the weather if you take care of its surfacing or if it's the right type of wood. Some types of woods last much better than others, but if you don't cover it and coat it, a lot of times it'll break down because of insects, things like that. So Martin Puryear is an interesting guy. He's known for different rich abstractions that have symbols of beauty. He uses really high level of craftsmanship, and he does a lot of things that are kind of like animal and human forms and things like nets, tools, and vessels. Interesting work that he does. So, we want to work with materials in a way. It's hard to work with stone in a planar way. You can get a big block and carve it, but you're not going to be super easily able to like make thin planes of it, right? It has its limitations. So same with wood. It has its limitations and it's used pretty well in particular ways. I want to quickly talk about the idea of what I'm saying here when I say assembling and carving. So assembling is when you're joining preformed pieces of material. It's different from carving and modeling, both of which are like forming it out of a mass, like a homogeneous mass. Like this piece is basically the same for every type of sculpture that uses carving, even wood or the material. You have a mass of material and you reduce it systematically, blocking out big areas and then defining the outer limits of it, and then carving down to the forms and planes until you get smaller and smaller detail, and then you finish it, the surface, right? Even with wood, it'd be the same. When we're talking about assembling, we're talking about joining and connecting preformed pieces of material, in this case, wooden things that have been milled. So pretty different from carving and modeling. Now, you can't model wood, but you can model clay and assemble clay. So this is an example of a material that has a lot of plasticity to it, right? You can move it and shape it. And in contrast to like reductiveness of carving, so you have so far in our kind of methodologies, reduction in carving, wood is additive, so there's subtractive and additive. Well, modeling is kind of interesting because essentially a building up process, so it's additive, and then it grows organically from the inside by adding and adding. And with clay, it works really well that you could actually add and then carve away. So there's kind of a way in which you could do assembling by making preformed pieces and then slipping and scoring them, modeling by building it up and up from the inside, and then carving back into it. Oh, pretty interesting. Clay also, has the ability to be cast, which we'll talk about in a second. So clay could be used in relief and in freestanding work or in the round. So could wood, and we've looked at stone relief as well. So it's not just for one type of sculpture, right? Clay has like 4 properties that account for it being widespread use. When it's moist, it's very plastic, easily modeled. When it gets partially dried out, it can be carved and scraped, and then it's also able to be really permanent and hard once it's fired. So it can be really easily moved about, kind of carved, and then when it's fired, it becomes really permanent. And it's able to be slip cast, which is when clay is really, really liquid, like a gluey almost substance. You can make a mold of an object like the original, the pattern, and then they added plaster in this case for slip around it, and then they took the mold apart. It was in 2 parts here. They made one part and then they made the other part. Had a separation by using a release agent, and then they cleaned it out from the original, and then they cast in the liquid into it, the slip, and then after they take it out of the mold and clean it up. So that's a really pretty extensive process. A lot of times I teach mold making. That's one of the projects in sculpture, but if you're really interested in it, I can tell you a lot about it. I really love mold making. I've done a lot of it, but it's pretty difficult to do remotely because of the type of materials you need to buy and the cost of them. If we buy them together as a class, it's much easier. And as part of casting, something we do often get to do when we take it in person as well is metal casting, which has a really long history as well, going all the way back to ancient Greece and even before that, with different cultures doing smaller types of metal casting and things. This is a piece by Jim Dine. He was kind of part of a social movement in the 60s, which was also the painterly movement of pop art. I guess you say social movement is there was a lot of social unrest and movements happening. And this movement of pop art really was shocked America in the art world because it talked about the the basic idea of mass production and kind of the critique of it, and it really in a lot of ways fundamentally altered the nature of modern art. And he began attaching objects like tools that had autobiographical significance to his canvases, and then he started to use them to cast metal, to be cast metal in like aluminum, or a lot of times they're in bronze. Castings of for art is in bronze, but that's more of a longer history, I should say, to do bronze casting. But this is a more modern type of metal that people use as aluminum. It's been used pretty extensively. Talk a bit about metal casting. Basically, you have like this here, some type of original pattern. You make it out of, you can either make a mold of it and get it into wax, or you can make a one-of-a-kind original in wax. Then you put a refractory material around it, which is able to be heated up without breaking. So this is the original. You have to create little sprues and gates so that the wax has a way to flow out. And then you heat it up, melt out all the wax so the wax can flow out, which leaves a cavity for the metal to be poured into. And you heat up the bronze or iron or aluminum really, really hot in a crucible, and then pour it in, and you have a copy of your original in a new material of metal. It's called lost wax casting. So really, really, really interesting process. We actually have the ability to do it at Merced College. But again, not something we can do remotely. Not to say we're not going to do interesting things, but just the class has to slightly change because of the nature of being remote. Metal can be also bent, folded, formed, and welded. So you can bend it, you can form it with heat, and weld sheets of it together. So metal, can be used in lots of different ways, just like wood. You can buy it in like a pre-sized standard thickness lengths and things like that. It's similar to like wood that has been milled. And then you can also, once you have it like that, change it, blacksmithing where you're forming it. You can get it really thin sheets and fold it, weld pieces together. So it's a very versatile material as well. A lot of modern and contemporary work uses things that have like a industrial nature, and some processes that were made through industry or created in industry. So most metals are extremely strong, hard, and durable with a lot of tensile strength. It permits even greater freedom than is possible with like stone or even wood. So an example would be like a life-size figure out of bronze that could be attached to a base. It doesn't need any support other than its own feet, because it could even be posed on a single foot because the metal has so much strength. Whereas if you had that in wood, it would not be able to be done without some type of supports, either internally or in some other way. And it can really be worked through hammering, folding, bending, joining, cutting with heat, basically, is one of the main ways, or abrasion when you have like grinders and things. So it can be worked in a lot of ways. Another material that has a really long history is plaster of Paris, or plaster. It's sulfate of lime. It's especially useful in the production of molds and also casts. And then a lot of artists in previous times have used it as like a preliminary for models. It was even used by Egyptian and Greek sculptors as a casting medium, and really versatile in the sculptor's workshop. A lot of people even use it as a finished material. There's different variations of it with cements that you can add that make it really strong, and it has no grain to it like wood and even stone, less grain to it, so it can be carved really nicely in any direction. It can be a little weaker though. Doesn't last as well outside unless you get certain types of hydrostones and things. This is an Oldenburg sculpture that's interesting, made out of plaster that's covering over chicken wire. And you soaked the plaster onto, like soaked canvas, I should say, or like burlap into plaster, and then created them, and then they have enamel paint over the top of them. It's depicting like everyday objects. Here's a pop artist. Um, he is pretty well known for a lot of public arts as well, pieces that are all over the world, and are pretty interesting, like ordinary objects like a spoon with a cherry becoming a bridge. And there's one in San Francisco of a giant bow, like Cupid's bow. So pretty interesting work he does. Plaster is really interesting because it comes in a powder form, and then when it's mixed with water, it becomes like liquidy, and it can be folded in, like poured into a mold, or you can wait till it gets kind of creamy, like I guess sour cream, and build it up over something like the burlap and chicken wire. So it has a certain amount of time before it sets and becomes hard and inert. So it's really pretty versatile. If you poured it into a container, you could then carve it after it was hard too. So you can do a lot of stuff with it. It's also resistant to heat. So it's part of the foundry process. A lot of traditional molds or the refractory is made by part plaster and part sand. So pretty interesting stuff for a sculpture studio. Concrete, really kind of connected in a way to plaster. And we could say that concrete, plaster, clay, they're calling it kind of all earthen type of materials in a way. This is a really interesting work by Rachel Whiteread. I love it a lot. Made out of cement. It was the casting of an inside of a Victorian house. And she completed it in 1993, and the house was going to be torn down. So she actually poured the whole inside. So this is the negative space made visible. Pretty interesting. Um, Concrete's a mixture of aggregate, like usually sand and small pieces of stone, bound together by cement. So it's rapidly replacing stone for certain types of work, I would say, because it's cheaper, it's hard, it's tough, it's durable, and it's really suitable for large outdoor projects as long as it has proper reinforcement. So stone doesn't need reinforcement because it's already set and solid, but it needs reinforcement to give it strength. So you'll see a lot of time rebar, metal inside of it with different types of wire and things to help it stay together, because it has a lot of compressive strength, but not necessarily a lot of tensile strength on its own. But if you do it right and if reinforced, it can have a lot of freedom of design using the right type of techniques for, like that are in the building industry. You can create some really gigantic scaled outdoor works, which this would be a great example of that. A newer material is resin or plastic. It can be cast and constructed. So it comes in sheets like plexiglass and different types of resins. And it could be, drilled and changed and moved around and joined and welded together with chemicals. But also it comes in liquid and you can pour it like we talked about with the plaster. This is a piece by Jedediah Caesar, building up layers and layers of plaster over styrofoam, and it's melded together. It really references like minimalism and the cubes, you would say, in that. And he says he makes objects inspired by the use of materials as signs, so language based, within urban and natural landscapes. So they become an index, or they become a sign of what has happened in the place and the actions. Interesting work, really. So another type of material that we haven't talked about really would be wax, which is often used. We talked about it up at Wolfgang Lab. lab, being ephemeral, and that's as a final project. Like he actually used the wax as the end result, but it's also used like plaster in the processes of metal casting as well. So just want to point that out. Some materials are good for processes as well as final things, and other ones are more used for just the final end result. There's a lot of methods and techniques that are used, right? And they're used for very different ends. This is an example to just show you like iron work, traditional blacksmithing, versus like David Smith using blacksmithing to create a very different type of piece in the 50s out of steel. So the same material can be used in a variety of ways. You know, it's not like it has a set way it must be used. Depends on the techniques they use and the aesthetic of the person making the work, right? It can't be identified. Sculpture cannot be identified with any special set of materials or techniques. There's sculptors who specialize in things like blacksmithing or metal casting or welding and blacksmithing, like I said again already, I said twice, or foundry processes or carving. But we can't say only one of them is sculpture and the rest aren't. You could specialize as a sculptor, but you have a lot of people who actually do work in a number of different types of materials. It just is about pressing into service whatever craft or method or technique will suit the purposes of the sculpture. So that goes back to the idea where I'm talking about using the material that works best for ideas. So it's really kind of about understanding. I'm going on and on about materials so much because part of sculpture is this relationship between you as an artist, your idea, and then material, the physicality of the material, how you use it to make your idea, and the ways in which it could be used or it breaks down when you try to use it are all part of that. It's like in the use of clay, we could make it into wheel thrown, highly glazed, beautiful surface decorated for a cup or dinnerware. But then also can be really different type of sculpture that's rough and totally like opposite, right? So part of this class is going to be about you messing around with material and understanding what you can maybe do with it, trying different things and being a little exploratory. And that's going to take some time, an investment of time to really get into that. Basically, I just want to say at the end that technologies that are developed for an industry, often for more like utilitarian or useful purposes, are often changed and adapted for sculpture. So useful artifacts and sculpted images have often been produced in the same workshops, basically, sometimes by even the same craftspeople helping artists. So what's an example of that? Foundry here. It might produce like engine blocks or something for one company, and then it produces Jim Dine's tool relief also. So it's got an interaction with industry that's very interesting. And I think some people take sculpture because they're interested in working in like movie making, all different types of areas that you could learn skills here and take them into different worlds. Or like David Smith, he was a welder, very skilled in that, and he brought his skill from the industry into art. So it works both ways, and it's really interesting type of realm to work in artistically. And I mean, as a sculpture professor, I absolutely love it and think there's so much to use it for and talk about in different ways than pictorial arts, which are also great too. All right, so that wraps up our introduction to sculpture. And if you have questions, feel free to comment in the question and answer cafe and we can talk more about it. All right, talk to you guys soon. Take care.